let's make a patchwork quilt. Welcome, I do sewing and DIY related content, and today we are going to be starting on a patchwork quilt. So you can see on the iPad I sort of drafted out what I was going to try to do, but basically it is going to be a mixture of different squares. So they are all going to be 6 inches by 6 inches, and we're going to have 36 of them. So cutting out 36 squares that are 6 inches by 6 inches, and I want my quilt to have kind of this ombre effect where it goes from light to dark. Now the best part about this is I am making an Etsy pattern for this entire quilt, so if you are interested in making one of these yourself and you want a little bit more instruction than what will be shown in this video, then that Etsy pattern may be a great choice for you. In it, I will also be including the metric units in case you are a little more familiar with those, as well as more step-by-step instructions. And if you are interested, I will include a coupon code in this video, which will be Patchwork 2023. So if you want to get 30% off, you can definitely do that. So you can see here, I am continuing on cutting out all of my squares. So just cutting out 36 6 by 6 inch squares. This is what they all look like, and you can kind of see that I have this different pattern going, but you could definitely play around with this and do whatever pattern you would like. The Etsy pattern does show you a diagram of how I did this. Now what's time to do though is sew these squares together. So with right sides together, you're going to be taking 2 of your squares, lining them up and taking a straight seam all the way across. So as you can see, I have kind of prepped 6 of these squares to be sewn together. So there are 2 squares, I have those with right sides together, and I'm just taking a straight seam all the way across. Now I am using a special foot for this to make it just slightly easier for myself. This is called a quilting foot, and it gives you that nice 1/4 inch seam allowance guide. I found it super helpful. So you can see I've already begun sewing these across, and all I do for this is I'm just going to line up my fabric with that guided edge, and then just take that straight seam, being sure to backstitch at the beginning, sewing all the way through, and then backstitching again at the end. And once you do this, you could definitely do a chain stitching method where you are doing multiple of these at a time, or you could just do them one by one depending on how comfortable you are with sewing all these squares up. You can see I did opt for that chain stitching method where I kind of started doing one, backstitched, kept sewing, backstitched again, and then I lined up another square pair so that I could just sew all these together. And then I just took my scissors, and where that seam is coming between those 2 squares, I'm just going to snip that so that you get them separately, and it was a little faster than having to start and stop for each of these squares. Once you've done this though, you can begin to lay out your quilt, and you are then going to repeat this for the rest of the squares. So just doing 2 at a time so that you would have all of these pairs sewn together. And then once you have that done, it will then be time to start building the columns. So what I mean by that is, so we have these 2 pairs of our squares, so we're putting the right sides together, and then I'm going to pin along that lower edge. So you could pin, you could use quilting clips, whatever you're most comfortable with, and then I'm just going to continue taking a straight seam. So I'm going to repeat this for as many of these squares as you would like to. So since the way that this quilt's going to work is going to have 6 columns, I ended up doing it for like 3 of the columns at a time. That was a little easier for me to understand. Now as I was going along pinning these and sewing it up, I did try to make sure that the edges were all going to match. So as you can see, we're going to have these 4 corners, and you want those corners to come together. So as you're going along pinning it up, make sure that your seam allowances are good. If everything is cut the exact correct measurements and you're using a really great seam allowance where it's the same for all of them, you shouldn't really have an issue. But I know, especially when you're first starting out sewing, sometimes your seam allowance can get a little off and it can make things more difficult. But as you can see here, I am just continuing on this process of matching, so those 2 squares that I've sewn together, matching them with 2 other squares that have been sewn together, and then I'm just going to pin and clip straight across so that I get that nice seam. The more even that your fabric is when you're sewing it up, the more even it will be when it comes time to line up all these columns together. So as you can see, I have all of the columns completed, and what I'm noticing when I start to line them up is some of the squares are slightly larger than others. And this could be because somehow the seam allowance got off on a few. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back through and fix those edges, and if you're in a similar position, you could just take that seam out and then redo it so that it has the correct measurement. But as you can see now, we have all 6 columns done, and it is now time to press these seams open. Now as you were going along sewing each of those individual squares up, you definitely could have pressed the seam open then. I just find it easier to do it all at once, especially because my iron is in a different part of the house. So I like to do it so that I have like a bulk ironing, and then I bring everything down and then go back up. So I just very carefully ironed everything out so I had those 6 columns that are now nicely pressed, and now it's just time to match 2 columns, 2 columns, and 2 columns. So there will be 3 seams for us to do. So very similar to how we did our squares, I'm just going to be matching right sides together of these 2 columns, lining it up so that all of the edges and the corners for those squares are matched very nicely. And then I'm just going to be using my quilting clips or my pins to pin this in place. Now this is the part where, when I talked about earlier that if your squares aren't necessarily matching and you want to go back through and fix it, this is what I did so that I could make sure they all were nice and matched. So once you have this all matched up for the first pair of columns, you can then repeat this exact same process for those other 2 pairs, so that at the end you will end up having 3 different column pairs that are ready to be sewn up. We're just going to be taking that exact same 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way up and down these 3 columns, so just taking that straight seam all the way through. So at this point I have them all sewn up now, so what it is time to do is I'm going to go ahead and press these out. As you can see, it all looks really nice, looks really clean and smooth. You could definitely trim any threads as well at this time, but I'm just going to press it out so that it lays nice and flat, and then we can continue on building this out. So now it is time to really finish this quilt top, and what we have to do is sew these 3 column pairs together. So very similar to before with right sides together, you are going to be matching 2 of these column pairs so that the squares are all nice and lined up, and then you will take a seam. Now if you are a little more comfortable, you could definitely pin that 3rd option onto the other side of whatever your middle panel is. It's totally up to you if you want to do that so that both are pinned at the same time, or if you just want to take one seam and then repin everything up for that 3rd panel. As you can see here though, I just did my back stitching at the beginning, and then I'm continuing on with that nice and straight seam. So this is again that 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I am just taking this stitch all the way down. I am being very careful that when I get to where those patches are, that everything lines up. So this is what the quilt top looks like. I think it looks so good. I love the different colors. So now what it's time to do is cut out the backing. So I'm going to use this fun palm tree fabric. I had so much of it, and all that I'm going to be doing for this is cutting it out the same size as my quilt top. I am going to be adding some batting to this, so I just have everything lined up so that the right side of that palm tree fabric is face down, and then I have the batting, and then I have the quilt top is facing up. And then I just trimmed everything so that it would be the same size, and then this will allow me to do the quilting. Now for this was my very first time I did free motion quilting. I've never done it before. I actually have a whole video up on how I did this though. I thought at first that I was going to try to draw out some patterns to do on the quilt. The pen didn't really work that well, and I was having some difficulties. As you can see here, I did test the pen first to make sure that it would go away. So that would be my first recommendation to anyone doing this. If you want to draw out a design on your quilt, be sure to test the pen in some sort of spot if you're using a pen to make sure that it will come off. So when I did this, it was good, we were good to go. So I just began trying to draw out some designs onto the quilt. I knew I wanted to do sort of a wavy effect, so very similar to that ocean look that especially that back of the fabric is portraying. And when I started to draw this on, that's when I started to realize it just wasn't going to work as well. So I'm just going to be kind of freely doing it and what works best for me. So I have my darning foot now onto my sewing machine. I adjusted all of my stitch lengths and made sure that the sewing machine was clean before I began. I did have an issue that if I did like a really small stitch length, it just didn't work as well. So I kept it at the normal stitch length that it was. And then I just began doing the free motion quilting. I found this really relaxing and fun. I would definitely recommend it if it's something that you are interested in. It gave it a really nice pattern look, and it did use a lot of thread, so that was my first surprise when I was doing this, but overall I think it turned out so well, and I'm really happy with the design. So last but not least, it was then time to add the binding. So you can see on here that the free motion quilting stuff is completed. It looks so nice. I absolutely love how this looks on the back. The front looks really good too. Everything came together so nicely with this quilt, and it was such a fun and easy pattern to do that I think that is going to be one of my favorite quilts for a really long time. Now for the binding, I do have another video up on how I did this, so I'm not going to go too much into detail. I like to create my own binding using the backing, and then I just hand sew it on. but this is what my quilt looks like. If you are interested, be sure to check out the Etsy pattern if you want more information. If you use code Patchwork2023, you can get 30% off, so you can make a quilt very similar to this for yourself. I will also be sure to include the links to the videos on free motion quilting, as well as adding binding to your quilt in case you want some more step-by-step guidance on how to do that as well. I love how this quilt turned out. I think it's a really fun end of summer project, and I think it looks really pretty. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see more, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks.